This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. Does diversity pay? Beyond the laudable goals of assembling the best talent pool, irrespective of race or ethnicity, does actively seeking diversity in executive leadership truly redound to a company's financial success? McKinsey, a highly regarded global consulting firm, asserts confidently that data from their 4 studies conducted in 2016 to 2023 unequivocally asserts it does. Their findings have effectively endorsed diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives worldwide, lending these programs the weight of scientific validation. However, such resolute claims must warrant a critical examination by fellow data scientists, who are bound to scrutinize the quality of the methodologies and data employed to arrive at these conclusions. To their credit, McKinsey has been transparent with their research methodology, having only anonymized the firms studied to safeguard client confidentiality. Given this transparency and the firmness of their research findings, how do their assertions fare under the scrutiny of peer review? Joining us today is Dr. Jeremiah Green, an associate professor of data analytics at Texas A&M Mays Business School and co-author of the recently published research paper, Does Greater Diversity in Executive Race Ethnicity Reliably Predict Better Future Firm Financial Performance? Dr. Green and his co-authors delved into McKinsey's research to examine the extent and causality of the purported financial benefits associated with diverse executive leadership. He will share with us what prompted his team to scrutinize McKinsey's findings and unveil the outcomes of their efforts to replicate the results of these 4 studies that undergird the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion programs worldwide. When I return, I'll be joined by Texas A&M Associate Professor Dr. Jeremiah Green. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by Texas A&M Associate Professor Dr. Jeremiah Green. Welcome to Hubwonk, Professor Green.
Thanks. Great to be here.
All right. It's a pleasure to have you. This is your first time on Hubwonk. We're going to talk about a paper you recently co-authored titled, Does Greater Diversity in Executive Race Ethnicity Reliably Predict Better Future Firm Financial Performance? It's a research paper that you examine the consulting firm McKinsey's widely accepted claim that diversity delivers to firms' bottom line. We're going to go deep on this, but before we do, I want our listeners to learn a little bit about you and the science of using accounting data for business analysis. You teach at Texas A&M, you teach data analytics, and you use it in your work. What does this field of data analytics do in the business community?
Okay, yeah, so in terms of data analytics for accounting, that's also a little more specific than just data analytics in general. Data analytics for accounting typically means we're using statistical approaches to analyzing financial reports. So if you think about a newspaper article that says Apple's earnings per share was, X dollars this year, it's looking at things like that, what they provide to analysts, what they provide to investors, and trying to understand what that means for the company, for investors, for other groups that are interested in looking at those financial reports.
So you examine differences in how financial data, again, you're looking at publicly traded companies, I assume. All of that should be available to someone who wants to analyze it. And you're sort of trying to relate how the different features of a firm's balance sheet either explain current success or perhaps predict future success. What's an example? We're going to talk about your analysis of McKinsey's analysis in this area. What's an example of where your work in sort of maybe a different topic might help our listeners understand the contours of your work?
Yeah, so an example of thinking about how financial information that companies report either explains their performance now or predicts their future performance. We might think about an example could be a paper by Mark Solomon. He is a professor at University of Southern California. What he does is look at ratios from the financial statements, so profitability or efficiency, and tries to see whether that predicts future what is he? He tries to predict earnings and future returns, stock returns. And that's the type of thing we might do. Some of my research is looking at predicting stock returns also. So we try and use those sorts of pieces from the financial statements to say, what can we learn from them, I guess.
So you polish crystal balls to help people who are potentially investors try to understand what might come in the future. We all know, everybody would love such a wonderful device, but it's challenging. That's why you need rigorous analysis and your best effort. So I want to then talk rather than the general concept. Let's dive at least a little bit into your paper, the recent paper. You wrote about the relationship between the diversity in the leadership positions of a firm and their probability of being profitable. We're going to talk about that in depth. What was your interest in writing about, of all the features of a firm, why did you want to examine why diversity might be, among all the other measures you can use in a company, one that might predict future profitability?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's probably worth putting in context what got us into that, and that is we've heard lots of claims by journalists and by, McKinsey, trying to that say that diversity in various forms improves financial performance. And so from an academic standpoint, I think we tend to be pretty skeptical of bold claims. So that's sort of one aspect. And the other issue is, if it is the case that diversity improves performance, then that's something as an accounting person that I want to know, so I can tell companies or students that if you increase diversity, it's going to improve your performance, and this should be a top level concern for something we might want to focus on.
So you either want to challenge a bold claim, see if it's valid, but you also, if it's valid, you want to incorporate it into your analysis for the future, right? You want to, it's a new yardstick to add to the other yardsticks used when predicting future performance. But I want to provide some background for our listeners. We're going to be looking at a study, or several studies, different studies by the same firm, McKinsey. This is a firm that's very, very well regarded in the global consulting world. This is sort of the gold standard of consulting. So when you're talking about challenging or examining studies, or 4 studies by a very, very well regarded consulting firm, these are you're taking on a Goliath, if you will. They've been around for about 100 years, I think. They're 2 years away from 100. So that the relevance when you're taking on somebody like a firm like McKinsey is to say that what they've put out is almost regarded, I want to use religious terms, but almost as gospel. Essentially, it's almost presented as it ought to be unquestioning. When we're talking about you as an academic versus a firm like McKinsey, which is consulting, aren't you more or less, when you're advising firms or analyzing what works in businesses, aren't you kind of in the same business, analyzing the same kinds of data?
Yeah, okay. Yes. So I guess the easiest answer is yes, we are using the same data. We're trying to understand and make similar conclusions. Can I push back just a little bit in that I would like to not say that we're trying to take on McKinsey or challenge McKinsey, but from my viewpoint, if we see research or conclusions based on research that are not justified by the evidence, then that is something that as academics we should be involved in. In terms of what we do with the evidence or decisions we make outside of that, that isn't really something I can say anything about. But yes, so in general, we're doing the same sort of thing, and we have the same sort of interests. We may not have the same sort of use of it after sort of we make these claims or whatever they are.
Well, I didn't mean to, I appreciate you pushing back, and I didn't mean to imply that it was some sort of hostility towards their the firm. Rather, you're an academic. All academics, we hope, present evidence and then invite their colleagues or peers, other data analysts, to scrutinize, meaning you get better. You don't want to keep a mistake a secret. You want others to scrutinize your work so that they can point out your mistakes. Every paper, I think, since the dawn of time, has mistakes. and you invite other very intelligent, let's say, colleagues, be they academics or consultants, to scrutinize your work. What I meant to say, you're taking on, you're scrutinizing McKinsey's work. Can we make that stipulation?
Yeah, that seems fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's just, before we get into the details, I mentioned there's 4 studies by McKinsey. I don't have the dates right in front of me, but I think the first was 2016, and the other just came out in 2023. They had similar conclusions. They became more confident as they went on. For our listeners, just at the high level, how would you summarize the conclusions McKinsey makes about diversity in high level, the board and C-suite leadership, and profitability?
Yeah, let me caveat it, or try and split that into 2 pieces. I think the first piece is they're pretty clear about what they do in mechanically and what they say within their papers. So when I go to make the step about what conclusions they make, those are slightly different than how they describe what they do. So in terms of the general conclusions, they say that having more diversity, like executive diversity, increases company performance. That's the general claim, even though they are more nuanced when they get into the discussion, I think.
Yeah, I went into the research, looked at the data, not the way you did, but more generally, but also I looked at the overarching summary, and in the most recent report, I want to quote for our listeners, just to add color to this conversation, how boldly they described the observations they made in this most recent paper. I'm going to report from, this is a quote from McKinsey's work, quote, "For almost a decade through our Diversity Matters series of reports, McKinsey has delivered a comprehensive global perspective on the relationship between leadership diversity and company performance. This year, the business case is the strongest it has ever been since we've been tracking, and for the first time in some areas, equitable representation is in sight. Further, a striking new finding is that leadership diversity is also convincingly associated with holistic growth ambitions, greater social impact, and more satisfied workforces," unquote. So these are pretty bold claims based on what they claim is decades of research and 4 studies. So that's where I want to start. Let's examine by defining terms. In that passage, McKinsey uses the term diversity. How does McKinsey define diversity?
Yeah, okay. So broadly, well, I guess let's do a simple explanation. What they really are trying to measure is how not concentrated their executive team is in any small or single group or ethnicity. So they're looking at ethnicity, different ethnicities. They group it into a few different categories, and then they try and say if it's all concentrated in one ethnicity, then that's not diverse. If it's concentrated, or if it's spread out across different ethnicities, then it's diverse.
So for the benefit of our listeners, I thought about this myself. I'm like, okay, what would make something a perfect score, and what would make a firm a terrible score? So a perfect diversity score would be whatever number of diversities you see. Let's say there's 8 or 5. I think those were the 2 different measures. If you have 5, one of each, and you have 5 board members, that's perfect score. If they're all white, or for that matter, all black or Hispanic, or pick it, Asian, that would be a bad score. So what we're looking at is how numerous, I suppose, how many different ethnicities are represented, and if there's any sort of particular concentration. Is that a fair characterization?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay. And of course, now that the other variable is, how does that relate to performance? Again, if diversity is hard to define, so also is performance. But what yardstick did McKinsey use in these studies?
Yeah, they used earnings before interest and taxes divided by revenues. So it's a measure of profitability. How, given the revenues that they generate, how profitable are those revenues in generating sort of a bottom line profitability measure?
So this is your expertise. They're consultants, and they have their criteria. As an expert yourself, is that a fair measure? Should you use that profitability score as a measure of performance?
Yeah, I think it's okay. You could argue for other measures, right? We might try and measure um, return to investors or something like that, but it's an important part of performance and probably a decent place to start.
So we've got two scores. We've got diversity and we've got performance. And again, this is a layperson analysis of their work. As I see it, what they did was say they looked at all firms. They didn't make clear which firms they were looking at, but all the firms, I guess almost 2,000 firms, and they ranked them in quartiles. They said, okay, we've got a bottom performing, bottom middle, upper middle, and top performing. And they compared the diversity score of those in the profitability of those in the top. Oh, I reverse this. They had diversity scores from bottom quintile to top quintile, and they compared the performance in the top quintile of diversity versus the performance in the bottom quintile of performance, and then looked at the difference between the two. Share with our listeners, how did that look?
Yeah, we'll stick with the general explanation like you're talking about, diversity and performance rather than get into the details of that right now. But by performance, they're talking about outperformance or underperformance. They're comparing average profitability relative to their industry. So if a company were to have profitability that's higher than their industry average, those are outperformers. If it's below their industry average, they're underperformers. So that's the specific profitability part. In terms of the diversity, what they do is rank companies, and in the top 25%, they compare those in the top 25% of diversity to those in the lowest 25% of diversity. And then they look and see how much more likely is the top diversity group than the bottom diversity group to outperform their industry. So they find something like around they're like 30% more likely to outperform their industry if they're in the top diversity group.
So that's the crux of the claim, which is to say the more diversity, the firms with higher diversity scores were more likely to outperform their average in their industry, and those on the low end of the diversity score were more likely to underperform. And they compared those two to really arrive at whether it's a trivial difference or a substantial. When we're looking at difference between signal and noise, all kinds of things can show up when we do analysis. The larger that difference, the more confident they were in their conclusions. I'm not sure. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but by my analysis, there was a substantial difference in the likelihood of profitability for more diverse firms than less diverse firms, giving them, I would say, again, reflected in the summary of their paper, high levels of confidence that diversity and performance are related, profoundly related. So say more about how confident their observations were and why they would be confident.
Yeah, I think you said two things there. So one is the magnitude of how much they're likely to outperform. So something like a 30% likelihood, more likely to outperform, is a huge effect. I don't know of hardly anything else that is that magnitude in terms of how important it would be, right? You can't like say if you let's say implement a new information system in your company, you're 30% more likely to outperform. That just doesn't exist, right? Like maybe 1% or something. So that's in terms of the magnitude of the effect. The other part is the statistical significance, and they report p-values that are less than 5%. So that would mean highly statistically significant.
So again, for our listeners who are not statisticians, I'm gonna take a crack at explaining p-values. I'm dusting off my graduate degree here and say, what we know about p-values is we want to be sure that our observation, or we want to measure the confidence that our observations weren't randomly generated. Taking any given set of numbers, all kinds of things can happen. The larger the result that you observe, the more likely that it isn't random. It's likely to actually be measuring something real rather than a statistical artifact. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonably good way to state it sort of loosely. I would add one more piece that It's about how the results in the sample that you're using, how likely is that to happen again in another sample? And so if we have a really small p-value, we would expect, that says it's very unlikely that what we see in our sample is a statistical anomaly. So if we go to another sample, we would expect to see a very similar result. So low p-value, highly confident that this is a reliable claim.
Right. So we imagine a large salami, every slice is going to be the same. If we're low p-value, wherever we look, we're going to find a similar result rather than, the next result to be the opposite. We're fairly confident that this is a consistent outcome. All right. So then I wanted to talk about one more dimension, which is we've established that at least McKinsey asserts that there's a relationship between diversity and performance. But there's another step, right? We have to sort of observe that in their case, there's a causational relationship, which is to say, as you say, it's both big, but it also one has to come before the other. The diversity has to happen, and then the performance has to happen for it to be causal. I hope I'm saying that right. Share with our listeners, in their analysis, does the way they measure and when they measure diversity and performance, does it sort of really show a causational relationship? You are diverse, then you outperform. Is that what this study really shows?
Well, short answer, no. So before getting too critical about what McKinsey says, they explain this in their papers, right? So they acknowledge that this is a problem. When you read their conclusions, that's a very different, they don't sort of match their conclusions to what they're saying, but let's take the first study for an example. They rank diversity in 2017, and then the performance, the profitability measure that they use is before the diversity ranking. So they're just with their design, it's impossible for diversity to increase performance because performance happens before the diversity happens.
So the proverbial cart before the horse, or this is something that academics in your field wrestle with all the time, right? Correlation is not causation. I might use I'll use something silly and say, umbrella use and rainy days seem to correlate, but it doesn't mean umbrellas cause it to rain. For our listeners, just briefly explain what a data scientist has to do to establish causation rather than mere correlation.
Yeah, what do we have to do to establish causation? That's difficult. I mean, the best case scenario would be we're in a lab where we can randomly assign something to happen, and then we see that the effect happens. So a couple things we can do. One is the direction that we had just talked about, right? The thing that causes something else should happen beforehand. The other part is we have to deal with other, what we call correlated omitted variables, something else that could explain the results that we're trying to claim are causal. So you use the example of the umbrella. Another typical one that I find easy to sort of conceptualize is ice cream sales and shark attacks are correlated. And we don't think ice cream sales drive shark attacks because we think something else is driving both of those, and that's warmer temperatures. And so we have to deal with those. Well, I guess two things. We have to go through the logic of, is this plausible? And then we also have to try and deal with other things that could cause that. So in the case of the ice cream sales, we would need to find a way to control for warm temperatures. So if we found, for example, that using diversity, that if we have some third variable, but we can find that it happens outside of when that third variable could affect it, then okay, we're at least more confident that there's a cause and effect happening.
Yeah, and so they acknowledge that. I'd say in the footnotes in this study, they do acknowledge the challenge with establishing causation. So I thought, sort of the people who are doing the analysis, unlike the people who write the headline for McKinsey, acknowledge that the data does not support a causational, but rather just a correlational. I want to caveat that if we're going to criticize McKinsey for something, is that fair? Meaning that the people doing the research acknowledge this limitation.
Yeah, perfectly fair. And I have no problem with their research at all. I have a problem with the connections of the, like you said, the headlines that they're putting out there don't match their research, right? And so that's right. I think they're pretty fair when you actually read inside the research. I think they're pretty straightforward about it.
All right, so we've set up this whole sort of conversation. Let's get to it. Like, okay, you say you connect more with the research of McKinsey rather than the headlines of McKinsey, but let's get into the research. Was McKinsey's report, were you able to essentially get their data sets and do analysis of the simple math, or was that something that's difficult to for them, that they're reluctant to share or they were unclear about?
Yeah, okay. So a few things. In terms of the method they use, they're very clear. So that it's not hard to go in and, if you have the data, to do what they did. The piece that they don't provide is the companies that they're using. So we don't have access to, right, their sample is something like 300 or 500 companies. Nobody but them, they're the only ones that know what those companies are. And so being able to perfectly replicate what they do is not possible unless they give us their companies. But other than that, the rest is very straightforward. You can just copy and do exactly what they do.
So, I mean, and of course, they didn't share which companies, not because they're trying to keep it a secret, but it's discretion. They don't want to, in a sense, out their clients, right? That's reasonable. They have a responsibility to keep that confidential. So you did find your own companies to analyze. As we mentioned earlier, p-value is very, very low, suggests that you're going to find this result more or less everywhere you look. How did you develop, again, if you're trying to replicate without the actual list of companies, you're just replicating the methodology rather than the actual data set. Where did you go to find companies to analyze?
Yeah, sure. We tried a few things. It's this is really the biggest challenge, I think, in terms of trying to replicate their research. So we started with the S&P 500. They have 500 companies. Theirs are international. So there are so many companies out there. If we look globally, it's hard to know where to start, but we know that they consult with a bunch of the largest companies. So S&P 500 is a pretty common benchmark for all companies. So that's where we started. So S&P 500, it's about the same size as their sample, and we know that they consult with many of them. And so to us, that was as close as we could get. As a side note, we also did a random sample. We thought of public companies, and tried the same thing. And no matter what we did, we get similar results. Well, I don't know. Is that good enough? We tried the S&P 500 and we tried a random sample to try and approximate what we think they did.
Yes, and of course, if their observations are going to be valid and your observation would be valid, they couldn't, in a sense, use selection bias to sort of craft their results. If they did, they would say among those companies, among the companies we looked at, this is true, but who knows about any other company? If that were the case, then no assertion would be generalizably true. It would be worthless observation. So in order to have their observations have any weight, they have to be generalizable. So your analysis and their analysis, though they're different companies, in theory, should show the same approximate result. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say even more than in theory, their p-values aren't valid if their sample is not a random sample. And so what their p-values should be is a reflection of what we should see elsewhere. And so, yeah, if we can get a sample that is meant to approximate the same types of companies that they're looking at, we should see something similar.
So the companies used, provided it's a large enough sample, are virtually irrelevant to an observation like this. So, and you replicated their methodology, which you say they were very candid about how they went about evaluating. So we've buried the lead enough. Given all your research, you had two co-authors and a substantial amount of time to analyze the data. Did your research see a correlation, we're not going to get to causation yet, between diversity and performance?
You just want the short answer? No.
No. Okay. I don't know if our listeners were anticipating that answer. It's the shortest of all the answers you've offered. So I want to go a little bit further and say, okay, we established early on that, well, we're talking about diversity. We're talking about diversity in the higher level ranks. We're talking about a large signal that they saw, that a large result of confidence in their result. You found no such relationship between how diverse a firm was and how profitable a firm was. Did you use the same exact, let's say I think it was earnings before interest and taxes. Did you try to tweak the numbers in any way to look at different metrics that maybe you were missing some variable that they accounted for?
Yeah, let me give a little more than you would see in the paper. So in the paper, we tried, I can't remember, 6 or something different measures. Outside of that, we were sort of convinced there's got to be something to this. So I tried every measure that I could think of. So I don't know what it was, 25, 30 measures. There's got to be something there, was my thinking. And no matter what we did, we couldn't find it. And this is replicating their approach, right? So we mentioned that they measured diversity and then looked at performance prior to that. And so I tried that with every measure, we tried it with every measure we could think of, no association at all. And then in another paper, so this paper that we've been talking about is with John Hand, he's at North Carolina. We also have another paper with Sekou Burmis, who is a strategy professor at North Carolina, and we flipped the direction. So then we tried to say, what if we measure diversity, let's say in 2017, and looked at performance after 2017? And, maybe we could get this sort of the right direction, and then we would find results. Nothing. So no matter what we did, and, this is, you don't see it all in there, but we spent an enormous amount of time trying to find any association that we could, and just can't do it.
So we're not going to even talk about causation, because where there's no correlation, of course, there could be no causation in either direction. So, that this is an extraordinary revelation, in my view. It's an extraordinary revelation. One would think even randomness might generate some sort of result. You could draw a line in the middle of a room and say, did the people on the left hand of the room have anything different than the people in the right hand of the room? You're going to find something somewhere. Guys named Joe may be different than guys, everybody else. You didn't find anything.
Right. I tried, right? I guess the only thing I didn't try, we did the S&P 500 and the random sample. I guess another thing we could have tried is just keep shifting around the companies and see if in any sample we could happen to find it, right? If it was just, you've looked through the data too much and randomly you should find a result. I guess that's the other thing we could try. But yeah, everything we tried, there's just nothing there. Oh, we also expanded it. When we started, we did it with 1 year, just like a single one of their studies, and then we expanded it to many years, and no matter what, we just can't find it.
So this is pretty powerful. When one finds no result, one can't say there isn't some relationship, but it's just not measurable, particularly given the data and the methodology. This is big news, because I think McKinsey has their influence is powerful. Corporate boards and C-suite people use that as sort of, I won't say gospel, but essentially as a North Star for many of their decisions. To make the assertion that they do, that it essentially is almost, well, not almost, it is proved that diversity leads to greater profitability. If I'm a leader of a firm or a member of a board, I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders, right? I don't own the company. I may be the president, but I don't own the company. I work for the shareholders. It's my job. I have to make choices for their benefit. If it's true what McKinsey asserts, then I would be violating my oath as a fiduciary to not make my firm more diverse. Without this evidence, in a sense, now we can't privilege diversity over other, let's say, of course, we want to make the firm profitable. we're not saying that this is morally or ethically a bad idea, diversity. We're not going there. We're just saying, as a measure of profitability, as a head of a firm, it's either imperative, it's a financial imperative that I use diversity, but without that evidence, no such imperative exists. We can essentially use more traditional profitability criteria when making our decisions. I don't want to go too bold here, but I want to say, if this data is not valid, or observation is not valid, I'll say that maybe the data is, won't this sort of upset the entire diversity push in financial markets?
Yeah, let me be careful in how I state this here. So I think I agree that if that were the case, right, and I think this is how, what you were saying has been used that way. If it is the case that increasing diversity increases performance, managers must increase diversity because that is going to improve returns to their shareholders. Fantastic, right? It's a good story. If it works, then the path forward is clear. Let me try and claw back some space for McKinsey here. So in the last study, the one that just came out in 2023, so that was actually after we had looked at the first 3 studies. They add other things that diversity might influence. So for example, employee satisfaction. So it's completely believable that diversity could influence employee satisfaction. You could think of a lot of reasons that might be the case. So in terms of that, great, right? That may be something that companies should care about. It may be something that employees care about. And if a company decides to make decisions based on that, then no problem. The challenge is, though, they can't sort of rely on this evidence to say it's going to increase performance, because that's not the case. I guess let me give the other side of that is, we don't find that it decreases performance either. So it doesn't seem to hurt or help in terms of bottom line performance. It could be it has benefits in other ways, but just not, the sort of bottom line profitability approach or, type of outcome.
I'm glad you point out the double-edged sword of finding no results, which is diversity, when pushed doesn't help. Of course, diversity when pushed doesn't hurt. So, maybe it's a Rorschach test to say which support you want to observe. That's fair, and I'm glad you did point that out. Again, no signal gives us all latitude to look for other things, and as you say, employee satisfaction. But of course, if it improved employee well-being or satisfaction or something like that, that theoretically we want that. Of course, it's a nice, it's inherently a good idea, but we would also think that would improve profitability. Again, if you want a signal, employee satisfaction isn't correlated with profitability. So, it's good, but it's, not a financial imperative. So what I really want to, again, I'm going to ask you to go on a limb here and say, okay, McKinsey has produced these 4 reports with glowing, summaries, and which are touted, in their legendary slide decks to C-suite executives and boards. Why would McKinsey, has built a reputation? I think that they hire the best, smartest people coming out of the best schools. Why would McKinsey make claims that their own data really wouldn't support? It seems, or at least it is impossible to reproduce. What do you see as a sort of incentive for a firm to, say, jeopardize their reputation for data, quality data and integrity?
Yeah, I'm glad you said you're going to ask me to go out on a limb, because this is just speculation, right? I don't know. Although we have examples in academic peer-reviewed research where researchers do things that would have bad consequences in terms of their reputation. So this does happen sort of everywhere. So I can't claim that well, we're reviewed, so we're so much better. But in terms of, I think the incentives, we do have some amount of, we are different. And I think the big difference, if I were to take I don't want to take a view like they were purposefully trying to misstate what they are saying, but I think they want to be able to tell companies you should do this, and we don't want to do that as academics. We just want to sort of evaluate the evidence. And so in the jump from here's what we found to should, I think that's where the misinterpretation of their evidence came from. That's my guess. If you're trying to tell a company you should do this, but then you tell them if you have diversity, you previously would have performed better, that isn't very compelling to get them to do something, I guess.
Right. There's so many ways to interpret it. Again, we're not inside the minds of McKinsey consultants, but of course, we all respond to incentives. Academics, hopefully, their reputation for integrity and accuracy is the sort of coin of the realm. In consultancy, perhaps, there is an incentive to tell your client what they want to hear. Or I'll say, again, I'm going to relate it to many topics we cover here on HubWonk. Is unfortunately this sounds like a political sort of an aspirationally political position, which it's going to go on my tombstone perhaps, is the unfortunate fact that when you mix science and politics, you get politics. This seems to be just one more instance where a revered institution has perhaps wandered off the path and compromised integrity for results that people prefer. Do you see this sort of perhaps as a potential they're victim of either groupthink or motivated reasoning?
Yeah, I hesitate to sort of make any judgment about the moral or ethical sort of good or bad. Is this good or bad? It does seem, I like your statement of if you mix science with politics, you get politics. That seems pretty accurate to me. So what I do think is that we should be aware of when we're interpreting what research says, and maybe particularly when it comes from people like consulting firms or groups like consulting firms, that we need to be careful of how it's being interpreted. And I think I hope we've shown that at least in these studies, you can't make the conclusions that McKinsey has been making. Those are they're just not correct. They're not what is shown in the data.
And that's fair. And one can understand why McKinsey, having found nothing in the data, that the headline cannot read, "We found nothing." So they took the ball and ran with it. Well, I appreciate you taking your valuable time with us today, Professor Green. It's a dry subject, it's a difficult subject, but I think peer review, scrutiny of academics with integrity is absolutely essential. We're not asserting whether diversity has a moral benefit. We're just examining whether it has the financial benefit that the study claims. So at least in this regard, you're shedding some light in what seems to be a fairly dark or cloudy area of analysis. Where can our listeners find either your study or your paper? I was able to access it. There were no paywalls or anything. Where might and you've published quite a bit, where could our listeners read more about your work?
Yeah, a few places. If you just search Jeremiah Green at Texas A&M, I pop up, so you can find my webpage and my CV there. If you go to Econ Journal Watch or Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy, that's where one of our other ones is. Or you can look up some of the co-authors, right? John Hand at UNC or Sekou Burmis at UNC. I think it's pretty easy on academics to find that stuff.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you again for joining me today on HubWonk, Professor Green. You really, I think, shed some light on a difficult topic. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This has been another episode of HubWonk. If you enjoyed today's show, there are several ways to support HubWonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to HubWonk on your iTunes podcatcher. It would make it far easier for others to find HubWonk if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're, of course, grateful if you share HubWonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about future episode topics, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of HubWonk.